They said it was just a contract. In reality, it was a noose woven in gold. The International Monetary Fund arrived with promises dressed as relief, carrying a deal worth $300 million. But behind the fine print lay a scheme designed not to help Burkina Faso rise, but to bind it tighter to chains it had never chosen. For decades, such agreements were signed quietly, away from public sight. This time, however, the curtain was pulled back in broad daylight. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before cameras and broke the script. He declared that no ounce of Burkina Faso's gold would be surrendered to foreign creditors. Not to the IMF, not to anyone. One sentence shattered months of maneuvering in Washington and Paris. One refusal set fire to a question that still shakes the corridors of power today. If one small landlocked nation dares to say no, what stops the rest of Africa from following? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe now and walk with the story. The story begins not in a battlefield but in a boardroom. For generations, Africa's destiny has been scripted in contracts drafted far from its soil, written in a language that appears technical but bleeds with the ink of control. The latest chapter was no exception. The International Monetary Fund arrived with what it claimed to be a lifeline, a debt relief arrangement worth $300 million. To the untrained eye, it seemed routine, almost benevolent. But buried in the clauses was something far more corrosive. At its core was collateralization. Burkina Faso was expected to pledge $300 million worth of gold reserves as security. If the country stumbled on repayment, whether due to global price shocks, political unrest, or forces entirely beyond its control, the IMF would seize the gold outright. Not quietly, not temporarily, but legally and permanently under international law. No appeal, no reversal, sovereignty reduced to paperwork. What appeared to be assistance was in truth a financial foreclosure waiting to be triggered. But the clause on collateral was only the first chain. Woven into the agreement was the so-called Phoenix dollar framework, presented as a cutting-edge digital currency designed to stabilize African economies. On paper, it looked modern, even progressive. In practice, it was a leash disguised as innovation. This Phoenix dollar would not be issued by Burkina Faso, nor by any African institution. It would be minted and managed in Western capitals, controlled by banks and think tanks already entangled in the continent's wealth. The result was a cruel paradox. Gold mined by African hands would serve as the backbone of a foreign currency, while ordinary citizens would remain excluded from its benefits. Imagine the soil itself, Burkina Faso's earth, rich with veins of gold, being transformed into collateral for someone else's future. Every ounce extracted would feed the Phoenix dollar reserves, while the nation received little more than token credits in return. It was a system more sophisticated than the colonial currencies of the past, yet carrying the same sting: control without consent, exploitation without armies. What the colonial rifle once enforced, the digital ledger now attempted to achieve. President Ibrahim Traoré saw through the mirage. Having already overseen the nationalization of several gold mines, he recognized that to sign such an agreement would be to hand back the keys just after changing the locks. To accept the IMF's offer would undo years of hard struggle for sovereignty. And so, when the cameras rolled in Ouagadougou, he did not hesitate. He denounced the package as an economic coup, not a metaphor, but a precise description of what was unfolding. A coup without soldiers, staged not with tanks but with contracts. A coup designed to overthrow economic independence without ever firing a shot. His rejection was more than administrative. It was symbolic, almost revolutionary. For decades, African leaders had been under the weight of IMF programs, signing documents in private rooms, presenting them later as unavoidable necessities. Traoré refused to play that role. He dragged the fine print into daylight and slammed it shut before the ink could dry. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. What had long been portrayed as a lifeline was exposed as a shackle. What had long been hidden was finally named. The reaction within Burkina Faso was immediate. Citizens poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, waving placards, chanting his name, declaring, "Not our gold," and "Africa is not for sale." They did not need technical briefings to understand what had just been avoided. They knew that $300 million worth of gold was not an abstract asset in a spreadsheet. It was the backbone of their schools, their hospitals, their roads, their very dignity. To surrender, it would have been to surrender the future itself. The symbolism extended beyond the capital. Across the Sahel, the announcement ricocheted through radios, WhatsApp groups, and Pan-African media. In Bamako, Malian officials applauded, declaring on state radio that a line has been drawn in the sand. In Niamey, Nigerian leaders hinted that they too were reconsidering their contracts. Even in Nigeria, murmurs began to circulate about revisiting resource agreements. What Western officials dismissed as reckless soon began to look like precedent. If one nation could resist, why not others? And if others resisted, how long before the very architecture of debt for resources collapsed? For Washington lobbyists and IMF technocrats, the rejection was thunderous. Months of negotiation unraveled in a single sentence. In Paris, commentators warned that isolation awaited any African leader who defied the system. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, it was not isolation that was felt. It was liberation, fragile yet undeniable. The soil that had long been bargained away in secret was, for once, defended openly. This was not simply a technical dispute over gold. It was the ignition of something larger, a declaration that Africa's wealth belongs first to Africans. Traoré's stance transformed what looked like a financial negotiation into a moral battlefield. The IMF had expected a handshake. Instead, it received a clenched fist, and with that gesture, a question was hurled into the future, one that no institution in Washington or Paris could easily silence. But what exactly lay hidden inside this so-called lifeline? So dangerous that Traoré had to slam the brakes before it was too late. The scene could not have been more charged. In Ouagadougou, under the heavy Sahel sun, President Ibrahim Traoré faced the cameras. His voice did not waver. With one declaration that Burkina Faso would not surrender its gold to the International Monetary Fund, he pierced through months of secrecy and maneuvering. The effect was electric. What had been whispered about in cafes, debated in parliament corridors, and speculated upon in financial circles was suddenly dragged into the open. And with that exposure came a wave of reactions that swept across continents. Inside Burkina Faso, the response was visceral. Crowds surged into the streets of Ouagadougou, not with confusion but with clarity. They carried banners proclaiming "Not our gold" and "Africa is not for sale." Women with baskets of fruit abandoned their stalls to join the chants. Miners, their hands still dusted with the residue of the soil, marched alongside teachers and students. It was as though the entire city had breathed in the same revelation, that dignity was worth more than any loan, that sovereignty was priceless even when measured against $300 million. The energy of the people did not merely endorse Traoré, it elevated him, turning his defiance into a collective roar. But while the streets of Burkina Faso echoed with celebration, the halls of power abroad reverberated with dismay. In Washington, anonymous IMF insiders leaked their frustration to the press. They accused Traoré of gambling recklessly with his nation's future, of risking financial isolation. Their language was clinical yet laced with fury. For them, Burkina Faso's rejection was not just a minor disruption, it was a dangerous precedent that could unravel decades of carefully woven economic discipline. One official was quoted saying that, if others follow, the entire system could collapse. Beneath the measured tones, the fear was unmistakable. In Paris, commentators filled television panels with warnings. They spoke of sanctions, of diplomatic cold shoulders, of investors fleeing the country. French newspapers painted Traoré as a firebrand whose populism would lead Burkina Faso into darkness. Yet their tone betrayed anxiety. France, whose history with the Sahel is tangled with decades of colonial and post-colonial entanglement, understood better than most that if Burkina Faso could resist, others in the region might feel emboldened to do the same. For Paris, it was not just about gold. It was about influence slipping like sand through clenched fists. Then came the solidarity that stunned observers. In Bamako, Malian officials praised Traoré's move on state radio, declaring that a line has been drawn in the sand. The message was not symbolic, it was strategic. Mali, too, had been clawing back resource concessions from foreign corporations. In Niamey, Nigerian leaders hinted they were reviewing uranium contracts long dictated by foreign capitals. Even in Nigeria, whispers spread that resource agreements needed to be reassessed. What Western officials feared most was already unfolding: the domino effect. One defiance could breed another, until an entire region stood united against a system that had once seemed inevitable. The media played its part in amplifying the tremors. Pan-African outlets framed the event not as an isolated rejection, but as the opening battle in a war for economic sovereignty. Headlines declared that Africa is drawing a new map for itself. Social media carried the chants from Ouagadougou to Johannesburg, from Dakar to Nairobi. WhatsApp groups buzzed with messages of support, Memes depicting Traoré slamming shut an IMF contract circulated widely. For millions of Africans, it was more than news. It was vindication. It confirmed suspicions long held that the fine print of debt relief was nothing more than another chain. Meanwhile, Western financial networks tried to contain the fallout. Analysts described Traoré's actions as reckless populism, a gamble that could scare off investors. But even as they dismissed his defiance, they could not hide the cracks in their own arguments. They admitted, often reluctantly, that if Burkina Faso could refuse, others might follow. And if others followed, the model of debt for resources, a model that had quietly underpinned Western economies, might unravel. What seemed to be about $300 million was in fact about billions in gold, uranium, and oil that sustained global industries. For ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso, however, the debate was simpler. The gold reserves were not just figures on a balance sheet. They were the bricks of schools yet to be built, the medicine for clinics in remote villages, the wages for farmers who fed the nation. To surrender the gold would have been to surrender the very possibility of a future chosen by themselves. Traoré's refusal became not just an act of policy, but an act of identity. It told the world, Africa will no longer sell its tomorrow for someone else's today. The contrast was stark. In Western capitals, leaders muttered of risk and recklessness. In the streets of the Sahel, people sang of dignity and hope. The same act, the rejection of an IMF contract, carried two entirely different meanings depending on where you stood. And therein lay the power of the moment. It exposed the divide not only in economics, but in worldview. For some, Africa was still a quarry to be mined under the guise of assistance. For others, it was a continent finally learning to guard its soil, its seed, its harvest. Yet as the chants in Ouagadougou echoed into the night, a question hung heavy in the air. Defiance had brought pride, solidarity, and hope. But what would it cost? Would Burkina Faso's stance trigger a wave of empowerment? Or would it provoke the kind of retaliation that history has so often delivered to African leaders who dared to resist? What happens now that the chain is breaking? The decision to slam the door on the International Monetary Fund did not remain confined to press conferences and street demonstrations. Its aftershocks reached deep into the veins of Burkina Faso's economy and politics, shaping not only immediate realities, but also the horizon of possibilities. For the first time in decades, the nation was forced to ask itself, what does it mean to stand alone? And what might be gained from that solitude? In the short term, the risks were obvious. By rejecting a contract tied to $300 million in gold, Burkina Faso denied itself a source of foreign credit. International investors hesitated, rating agencies whispered of downgrades, and Western commentators predicted financial isolation. The IMF, accustomed to obedience, made clear that its patience would not be infinite. Rumors swirled of aid packages being reconsidered, of partnerships put on hold. For an economy already fragile, the warnings could not be ignored. Hospitals still needed medicines. Schools still required teachers. Farmers still depended on subsidies to plant the next harvest. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of collapsing under the weight of financial threats, Burkina Faso turned inward. In 2025, the government announced the nationalization of 5 major gold mines, bringing them under the control of the state-owned company, SORMIB. Overnight, the flow of wealth changed direction. Revenues that had for years been siphoned to foreign shareholders were redirected towards the national budget. That gold, accounting for nearly 1/5 of the country's GDP, was no longer a line on someone else's balance sheet. It became a lifeline for Burkina Faso itself. The impact was not abstract. Within months, funds were allocated to repair rural clinics that had languished under decades of austerity. Salaries for teachers, long frozen, began to rise. Small infrastructure projects, from bridges to irrigation canals, received financing without the burden of foreign conditions attached. For the people, it was a revelation. The soil beneath their feet was not cursed with dependency, as they had long been told. It was rich, and when managed with sovereignty, it could nurture futures. Politically, the defiance solidified Traoré's image as more than just a transitional leader. He was cast as a guardian of sovereignty, a man who had dared to call out the system for what it was. His use of the phrase economic coup echoed through the region and beyond. For many, it was not merely rhetoric. It was a naming of a truth long felt but rarely spoken. In international circles, this moment was often referred to as the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not because tanks rolled through Ouagadougou, but because one voice overturned decades of unquestioned submission. Of course, the path was not free of peril. The same boldness that inspired admiration at home stirred unease abroad. Opposition parties within Burkina Faso raised concerns that the rejection of international support could isolate the country further. They warned of rising inflation, of shortages, of the dangers of placing too much faith in resource nationalism. Yet for every skeptic, there were 10 supporters who pointed to the visible gains already achieved. Gold revenues redirected, state control expanded, dignity restored. The debate was not whether sovereignty mattered, but how much risk the nation was willing to bear in its defense. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the political ripple effect grew stronger. Mali and Niger, already charting their own course away from French influence, found renewed courage in Traoré's stance. Conversations about resource contracts, once whispered in private, now took place in public forums. The idea that Africa's wealth must serve Africans ceased to be radical. It became common sense. In Niamey, officials began reviewing uranium contracts. In Bamako, gold concessions were reconsidered. Each move, however modest, traced its inspiration back to Ouagadougou. For ordinary citizens, the change was not only material, but psychological. For generations, many Africans had been told that development could only come from outside, that aid was the inevitable path, that sovereignty was a romantic but impractical dream. Now they saw a government daring to reject that logic and to build on its own soil. Farmers began to believe that the harvest of their labor might finally feed their own children before it fed foreign markets. Students, once cynical about politics, chanted slogans of pride in the streets. Miners, whose sweat had enriched corporations abroad, now demanded fairer wages backed by state control. The mood was not naive. It was resolute. Still, challenges remain. Resource nationalism is no guarantee of prosperity. Without careful management, corruption could corrode the very victories it sought to secure. Without diversification, dependence on gold revenues could become another trap. And without regional solidarity, Burkina Faso risked standing as a lone defiant voice against powerful global institutions. The nation had stepped onto a path both hopeful and hazardous, and every step forward would test its resilience. The central truth, however, could not be erased. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was no longer negotiating from its knees. It was standing upright, facing both its people and the world with dignity. The rejection of the IMF contract was not only an economic decision, it was a political reorientation, a civil awakening, a turning of the soil so that new seeds might be planted. Whether those seeds would flourish or wither remained uncertain, but the act of planting them marked a rupture with the past. And so the question lingers, echoing beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Is this defiance the spark of a wider revolution, or merely a solitary flame struggling against the wind? From the moment President Ibrahim Traoré uttered his rejection, the ripples extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The reaction of international institutions and global powers revealed not only their concern, but also the fragility of the system they had built upon African compliance. The African Union responded cautiously, issuing statements that balanced diplomatic restraint with a subtle recognition of sovereignty. Publicly, officials spoke of the need for stability and dialogue. Privately, however, whispers circulated in Addis Ababa that Traoré's defiance had captured the imagination of leaders who had long grown weary of conditional loans and external dictates. The economic community of West African states, once quick to sanction governments deemed defiant, found itself divided. Some members echoed Western warnings of isolation, while others, especially in the Sahel, hinted that the winds of policy were shifting. Across the Mediterranean, European voices grew sharper. The European Union issued warnings of serious risks to investor confidence. French commentators in particular framed the rejection as reckless, a populist gamble that would leave Burkina Faso vulnerable. Yet beneath their stern rhetoric, one sensed unease. France, historically entwined with the Sahel's mineral wealth, knew that if Ouagadougou's stance hardened into doctrine, its leverage could weaken irreversibly. The gold of Burkina Faso was not only an economic asset, it was symbolic of a broader contest over Africa's future. In Washington, the dismay was open. Analysts on American financial networks labeled Traoré's move irresponsible, a gamble with his people's survival. IMF insiders, accustomed to quiet compliance, could not mask their frustration when speaking to the press. But perhaps most striking was the shadow of the Phoenix dollar. Marketed as an innovation, it was in fact underpinned by networks linked to American political figures, including associates of former President Donald Trump. For critics, it was proof that the scheme was less about helping Africa modernize and more about embedding Africa's resources into Western-controlled frameworks. For supporters of Traoré, it underscored the righteousness of his rejection. Africa would not mortgage its future for another foreign experiment. Meanwhile, the narrative on Pan-African platforms was entirely different. Media outlets across the continent hailed the defiance as the opening chapter of something greater, a struggle for dignity that might ignite a Burkina Faso revolution. They did not see recklessness. They saw courage. They did not speak of investor confidence. They spoke of sovereignty reclaimed. From Dakar to Nairobi, the tone was not caution, but celebration, framing Burkina Faso's stand as a rallying cry for a continent long subjected to economic subordination. This divergence in narratives revealed the essence of the moment. To Western capitals, Burkina Faso had made a mistake. To much of Africa, it had made history. The clash was not only over gold or contracts, it was over meaning itself. What sovereignty looks like, who defines progress, and who owns the soil that yields wealth. But the most pressing question remained. Could this solitary act of defiance transform into a continental movement strong enough to withstand the inevitable pushback of the world's most powerful institutions? Can Africa truly rewrite the rules of global finance? The rejection of the IMF's golden trap was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a longer, uncertain journey. For Burkina Faso and for the Sahel at large, the path ahead now forks into two directions. One lined with risks, the other with possibilities. The risks are real. Isolation remains a weapon readily wielded by international institutions. Credit ratings can be slashed, sanctions whispered, aid suspended. Foreign investors, always cautious, may retreat further, leaving gaps in financing. For a country that still struggles with poverty, insurgency, and fragile infrastructure, such pressure could bite deeply. Resource nationalism, if mismanaged, can slip into inefficiency or corruption. The soil may be rich, but without careful stewardship, the harvest could still fail. Yet the opportunities are just as tangible. With state control of gold mines already in motion, Burkina Faso has begun redirecting revenues to its own people. The creation of a sovereign development fund, backed by those resources, could anchor future budgets. Regional institutions such as the African Development Bank and Afreximbank offer alternative channels of support, lending against African priorities rather than Western conditions. For the first time, the continent is building its own safety nets, rather than depending on outsiders. Trade holds another key. The African Continental Free Trade Area is more than a bureaucratic document. It is a vision of economies linked not by foreign approval, but by African initiative. A Burkinabe refinery processing goal for Ghanaian industries, Nigerian oil exchange for Malian cotton, Kenyan technology powering South African markets. These are not distant dreams, but the beginnings of a continental cycle of value. Each transaction kept within Africa is a brick in the foundation of sovereignty. Currency, too, is being reimagined. If the Phoenix dollar represented a digital leash, then African leaders are considering currencies of their own. Conversations about regional or Pan-African digital money are already taking place in Addis Ababa and Abuja. A currency backed by African reserves, controlled by African institutions, would sever the dollar's chokehold and finally allow policies to reflect African needs rather than foreign dictates. The very tool once used to colonize, money itself, could be repurposed as an instrument of freedom. Most importantly, unity is beginning to stir. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have already aligned their voices on security and resource policy. What was once derided as instability is now transforming into a doctrine of survival. Sovereignty through solidarity. For a continent too often divided by borders drawn in foreign capitals, this alignment signals something profound. Alone, a nation may be vulnerable. Together, a region can resist. The fire of sovereignty has been lit. Whether it flickers or spreads will depend on choices yet to be made. Choices by leaders, by institutions, and by the millions of citizens who now see dignity not as a dream, but as a right. The soil is turned. The seeds are planted. What grows from them will define not just Burkina Faso, but the African century to come. But is this the dawn of a new era, or merely another struggle soon to be smothered by the weight of global power? What began as a battle over a contract worth $300 million has revealed itself as something far larger. The International Monetary Fund expected compliance, a signature on another page of dependency. Instead, Ouagadougou answered with defiance. President Ibrahim Traoré did not merely reject the fine print. He named it for what it was, an economic coup staged not with rifles but with clauses. In that moment, a silence that had hung over Africa for decades was broken. The consequences reached far beyond Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, leaders and citizens alike have glimpsed an alternative, however fragile: sovereignty chosen over subordination, dignity defended over debt. For too long, Africa's wealth has been bartered in rooms outside the continent, its future reduced to figures and spreadsheets. Now, with a single refusal, that inevitability has cracked. What the streets of Ouagadougou celebrated was not simply the rejection of one deal, but the possibility of writing their own terms at last. This is why commentators speak of the Ibrahim Traoré coup not in the language of tanks or generals, but in the vocabulary of dignity. It was a coup against inevitability, against the presumption that Africa must always kneel before external creditors. And it was not an act of isolation, but of invitation, a call for others to imagine a different road. The Burkina Faso revolution may still be in its infancy, but it has already redefined the horizon of what is possible. Yet the questions remain urgent. Can Africa construct financial institutions strong enough to replace those that once dominated it? Can sovereignty survive the pressures of sanctions, shortages, and isolation? Or will the weight of global power smother this fragile flame before it spreads? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions upon which futures rest. What is clear is this: the death rattle of a financial empire can already be heard, and in its echoes lie the birth pangs of an African century. Once the fire of sovereignty is lit, it does not extinguish easily. It spreads from soil to soil, from border to border, until it becomes impossible to contain. If this story stirs something in you, a sense of justice, of pride, of hope, then do not step away. Join us by subscribing, sharing, and adding your voice in the comments. Let us ask together, should Africa ever trust the IMF again?